But I do have 20 minutes. I'll try and keep it quick. I normally do this in 40 minutes. I'm already trying to condense it. And some of the stuff that I'm talking about is kind of covers off from the history and origins of open data, which comes from a perspective very much similar to open source communities as well. And so I'll kind of brush on some of that, but I do want to keep it somewhat technical and talk about use cases between how CKAN's used within federal government and other jurisdictions, as well as how Drupal is used as a web experience management system in government and other jurisdictions. So public data is the new way of terming open data to kind of shift away from that transition state change. We're not just opening data, we're talking about public data like public goods, like parks and swimming pools and things like that. So I'm the Executive Director of Link Digital, which has been around since 2001. It's probably since 2013 that we've really been in the Drupal space. I went to Drupalcon in Munich and met with the CEO of a really cool company called Q-Area in the Ukraine. And that solved part of our supply chain issues in really doing Drupal well. And we've been partnered with those guys for 3 or more years now, and working on a number of Drupal projects. If you're Canberrans, you might know the ActTab website before it got taken over by Tabcorp. That was one of our biggest transactional Drupal jobs back in the day. It's now deprecated. We're an Amazon Web Services advanced consulting partner again since the start. And it ties into some of the work we do because you can do infrastructure programmatically. You can basically arrange your infrastructure security roles, spin up instances, organise storage and compute however you want, network. So we've been doing some projects on building supercomputer capability for educational institutions. That would be used to process data. The data would be used to create insights and white papers and research outcomes, which would be published as open access. There's a whole bunch of what we call data pipelining or workflows revolving around all this. I'm on the board of Open Knowledge Australia, which is a non-profit civic sector sort of organisation that promotes free and open access to knowledge, i.e. data as well. And I'm also a steering group member of the CKAN Association. So there's Ashley from the UK, Antonio from the UK government, and Open Knowledge themselves from the sort of central perspective are involved as well. So CKAN, basically, these are the main points I wanted to deliver today, but there's the rest of the talk is context around that. There is a Drupal distribution called DCAN, but DCAN is not CKAN. It did evolve at the same time. It basically shares some of the same API methods, and whether or not it's completely on the same roadmap as CKAN is sort of up to New Civic, who's developing it, and CKAN tech team and how they're developing. But essentially, it's 2 open source projects. DCAN is a distribution. CKAN is a Python web app with PostgreSQL behind it. CKAN is kind of owning Australian government at the moment. So my company manages platforms for federal government, New South Wales, South Australian, Victorian government and Western Australian government, as well as some councils such as Brisbane City Council. And we're doing more work sort of internationally as well now. But it's kind of cool because where it's coming from is the governance and provenance of data, which is intrinsically linked back to jurisdictional artefacts. So, administrative and legislative acts. How do we form laws which control government and public works? So once it's been established in CKAN, it's kind of a source of transparency, lending that term from a source of truth. If the government's going to put something out there and have it critically reviewed, then it'll be on their state or federal jurisdictional data platform. There is some work that's already been done between integrating Drupal and CKAN in various fashions. So one of our staff contributed to the Drupal 7 user authentication, where you can use basically Drupal users to authenticate into CKAN to provide a single sign-on. There's also relatively easy work because CKAN can be, the whole catalogue can be read via the API. You can easily pull that into taxonomies and then use those taxonomies as terms, the terms within them, within drop-downs and lookups. So common use cases are if you're going to build a web form that allowed the general public to make data requests, you might as well give them a drop-down form and say, is the data request already on our platform? Is it like an improvement request rather than an actual new data set request? So we did that sort of work for Victorian government. Web forms to CKAN is another really easy win. Building a module that basically ingests or pushes directly into CKAN can be done via the API as well. A useful use case, I would think, is if you're going to do a public consultation, something like a new report is being commissioned and you want the public to actually provide some response back to that, so that the responses are filtered directly into an open and transparent platform from the start. Each submission can easily go into Drupal.gov.au via the API at a record level, because if the resource that's contained within CKAN is basically a CSV or tabular format, you can do insertions directly into it via the API. That then lets the public review the feedback as it's coming in on the fly. There's no sort of air gap. Resource views in Drupal as well. So CKAN has a concept of resource views. I'll go into what it is a little bit further later. But data visualizations, the resource itself is like the CSV file or the WMS endpoint, things like that for geospatial. And CKAN can render those out as views. Those views themselves, like a YouTube video, can be embedded on other websites via the WYSIWYG editor, probably configured by the WYSIWYG fields if you wanted to. And telling stories with data. So again, if you're on a departmental or program-specific web experience project, you're trying to curate this and tell a story about some data. You might have been doing a whole bunch of surveying and analysis, creating reports. Some of those have charts and graphs. Fundamentally, if the source of transparency, again, is on data.gov.au, then over time it would change. So this report might be a time capsule of 2015, but if it's expected to change in 16, 17 and 18, it would be better to reference data.gov.au and actually reference the data set and intelligently grab the resource and present the resource view back onto your article on that. Drupal and CKAN, I thought I'd just show you a couple of these installations where both Drupal and CKAN are already used for open data portals. So New South Wales government, that's the Drupal side, that's the CKAN side. In large part, they're mostly just aesthetic integrations to greater or less degree. Data Victoria, and that was the Drupal side. This is the CKAN side. It has a bit more of an integration because, as I said, there's some taxonomies that are brought into Drupal so that you can target data sets in web forms. And it also has a single sign-on. Data South Australia. And also Brisbane City Council as an example. Now, those aren't really great examples of a full aesthetic integration. If you look at where things are going, though, something like the Singapore Open Data Portal, this is a CKAN specific open data portal. There's no Drupal involved currently, but essentially what they're doing is they're taking the data catalogue itself, which is organisations, data sets, resources, with some other grouping activities. So you can create literally groups such as communications, infrastructure, that sort of thing. And bringing forward some of the visualizations that you might otherwise have in something like resource views onto some of the upper level pages. So the Singapore government has resource view widgets or cards on the homepage, on the organisations page, on the groups page as well, and also on the dataset page. In most CKAN portals, you don't get until the resource page that you see the resource view as per the name. So it starts to ask the question, well, if you're going to selectively, say on a groups page, of these 5,000 data sets that might be for a group, within a group, which ones are going to make it onto the home page as a visualization? Then we start to talk about curation and content management, and that's really a job more for Drupal. And I think that's sort of the key thing. This diagram kind of illustrates where, when we're talking about open data and solving problems around the information economy or the economics of open data, on the x-axis there, we're talking about open data and IT type solutions, and on the y-axis, we've got other factors such as institutional or governance change, and one of those factors certainly is that web experience. What's the user experience that we're going to provide to people as they access these data resources? When we're going to present something with insight, how are we going to control that experience so that users get the right insight or get the best opportunity to receive the right insight? And yet that's usually a job for something like Drupal. So I think there's a natural driver as to why many portals have some content management system integration when considering CKAN. So what is CKAN? I might as well go through the 101. It's open source, it's a large and expanding user base. So I mentioned a bunch of Australian portals, jurisdictions using it, but it's also used by the European Union, Government of Canada, Government of UK, US government, and quite a few around the world now. It has expanding use cases in the wider data ecosystem as well, not just above the surface, but below the surface. So it's used a lot for harvesting from other sources. In fact, a lot of CKAN portals don't even have data as part of the storage platform. It just references, it catalogues data sets and then links off to an external URL, which might be hosted by an agency. The federal government here is a bit more unique in that it encourages people to upload data, which is actually very good. And you can see how down the track, if we're going to have large geospatial data sets or large or high volume transactional data that's coming through Internet of Things type sensor architecture, then how are we going to solve those sorts of data storage problems yet still have an open data platform sitting above it? So one of the areas where I'm looking at with CKAN is how we use it as more of an infrastructure orchestration platform as much as a data catalog. So we've got a concept of resource views, building a concept of resource containers, and allowing people who are the data custodians to provision resource containers. The important point there is number 5. CKAN is essentially, if you think about the primary, secondary, and users, tertiary users, the primary is other machines. Its API is really what is exposed to the internet, and people and machines can get the most use out of it. Custodians are then the secondary users, so the ones that actually have to mark up the data with metadata and actually publish the thing. And then end users, in a way, there's a variety of those as well, but they're not your common end users, your typical end users. They're usually developers who might be looking for data sources that might be building something upon it anyway, or data journalists that might be looking for the latest government report or data on certain aspects of what that programs. So if you think about that in terms of CKAN and then consider what Drupal is and what its primary, secondary and tertiary users may be, you might think, well, the primary user is actually an end user for Drupal. The web experience is pretty important. Secondary user might be the developer again, but really it's probably the content creator, because they need, as we see in multiple Drupal presentations, some flexibility, some control, some guided flexibility and some control to really create an appropriate web experience. So CKAN and Drupal have very different users, which means that the project roadmap is going to be very different over time, which is why it's a good reason to build integration paths between the two. You can download it from ckan.org. You can learn more at ckan.org, and you can download it from GitHub. Its structure, as I mentioned, there's organisations beneath that. So organisations for us are our departments, essentially in federal speak. Data sets then sit below that, and a data set is really a collection of resources. So you can imagine a data set such as the Australian Government Organisations Register. You'll actually have the CSV file, which has all the government entities with columns to tell you whether it's a corporate or non-corporate entity, who is its parent as an entity, when it was instantiated through legislation or whatever, all that kind of stuff. However, there might be another resource there that's simply a PDF file that talks about the data set. So you can have multiple resources attached. And certainly one of the things that Drupal has and other CKAN portals has is transformational scripts, which allow you to transform from CSV to something else and something else again. So it's a fairly easy cataloging structure, but behind that is all its power. It has platform custodians, like a whole of platform type administrator. And it also then has organisation custodian, editor and member. So authentication basically occurs at that level, that if you were to log in and you wanted to add a data set, you'd need to be a member of an organisation at an editor or custodian level. at a custodian level of an organisation, if you remember, you can then add another user. You can change their roles, things like that. And it's hierarchical, so you can have an organisation, sub-organisation, and organisations will have some control over sub-organisations, but those sub-organisations can't control sibling organisations in the hierarchy. The reason why I think that's all really cool, again, is if you go back to where these platforms are coming from, is usually through a whole-of-government approach. So as the source of transparency about the government releasing data, usually the organisations are fairly well up to date. And usually the data custodians are fairly well accurate as well. So if we're going to do something within government, such as private-public partnerships, and engage the community to co-create things for us, it makes sense to bring them into something like a CKAN platform and publish along with the data things like code, because you already know that you've got the correct organisational hierarchy. So I think that's going to be kind of interesting. And again, co-creation and building things through smart web experience management systems is integral to all of that. So I think there'll be a lot of crossing of paths between CKAN and Drupal over the years ahead. So the use case paradigm, I've mentioned this: constitutional artefacts, parliamentary and legislative acts, which essentially create a jurisdictional platform for CKAN. You might then have ministries which become organisations, or departments which become organisations. You might have programs which might be sub-organisations. You might then have projects that create data sets. And so the metadata is captured at the project level. What's its temporal aspect? What's its spatial aspect? How often was it updated? How frequently is it updated? Or when was it last updated? And then the outcomes themselves might be resources, literally a CSV export, which is a particular facet of the data set that was collected through the surveying process of the program. The user experience, it's a fairly simple CRUD application, so there's nothing special there. And again, really, as the primary thing is the API, everything you can do in the UI, you can do via the API. So there's no reason why you can't build WordPress, Drupal, and X other content management system, workflow systems that deeply integrate with CKAN and create data sets, create users, create resources, do sophisticated extract, transform, and load functions, and then push them into jurisdictional platforms. Custodian workflow, again, pretty simple. You just log in, add a data set. Once you've added a data set, you can then add resources. You just have a decision as to whether you're just linking off to those resources or you're going to upload CSV files or zip files or whatever it might be. Looking at the Australian government or the AGLS metadata that we've got on data.gov.au, that's shared, or there's a metadata sharing program between New South Wales, South Australia, and federal government at the moment, and a bunch of others, but they're the main sort of jurisdictional top-level ones. And then predictably, there should be the same sort of work occurring over the months ahead. I'm not in the public sector, so I'm not claiming anything's happening, but that's the sort of thing that you'd expect to see, that the metadata hierarchical sharing occurs across all states and territories. You would expect then that each state and territory would start to work on how it's harvesting and bringing into its state jurisdictional platform the data from agencies, and potentially also from the third level of government with regard to councils. The only differentiator there would be that councils that are large enough to have their own ICT policy, strategy, vision, etc., will typically have their own portal as well. So Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, places like that. There might only be 10 of those, but all the other councils, I believe, personal opinion, in the future will end up being wrapped up within a state or territory platform. I won't go through the metadata, but the API, this is sort of as technical as it gets. You know, you can grab JSON listed, formatted lists of the site's data sets, groups, and other CKAN objects. You can get the representation of a data set, resource, and other object. You can search for packages, which are basically data sets, or resources matching a query, create, update, and delete. And you can get activity streams, so kind of like a blog roll, what's happened recently on the platform. CKAN is actually used as a private data repository or catalogue as well by a number of our clients and in other places as well. So you can kind of use it as an information asset register, where you definitely can. So within an agency itself, cataloguing all the things and making sure you know what you've got. You don't just have zip files or CSV files in people's hard drives. And again, ingestion is pretty key to that, because you'll have other information management systems and data management systems that you'll pull into it. It kind of goes back to, when you're developing a Drupal app, you're always looking for the source of truth about a data object. Who's going to create this? Who's going to modify it? What's the maintenance required around all of this information? It's not just a content migration task when we're looking for these key snippets of data. So I think over time you'll see, again, a more evolved notion of data quality management frameworks within agencies that really come to this from first principles and build catalogues such as on CKAN as information asset registers with quality management plans and data management plans. And then they become the source of transparency. Truth can always sit within the Oracle database, but transparency may sit more in a data catalogue. File store, whether you're hosting the actual resources, can be done in CKAN. Data store is a neat addition to CKAN that transposes, or basically transforms CSV files on the fly and makes them API readable. So you get an API to read into the CSV file, and you can target specific rows. You can do add, edit, delete, etc. Obviously, you can select licenses because it's an open platform, so you can specify whether it's Creative Commons or some other bespoke license. And you can set up harvesters to harvest content into it. So that was the 101. I should give you a quick case study. I've only got a few minutes, so I won't go too long, but our company participated in the Canberra Digital Challenge, and we built a public video and image library to meet the requirement of building a whole-of-government video and image library. Typically, that's the sort of project that would be met with a digital asset management system. So you're managing image assets and video assets, you're cataloguing them. It's a bespoke piece of hardware, or software and hardware. But we took that challenge and sort of met it with CKAN primarily, because that's our golden hammer, and said, well, what would an open digital asset management system look like? One that can be shared across the whole community. And were the government to invest in this thing, how could they build it like an open data portal? So we pulled together Amazon, Drupal and CKAN as the solution architecture, and sort of reimagined things. So on the front end, we're looking at the public image and video library, and this is a Drupal website. It basically is pulling from CKAN all of the information assets, and it's also providing some user access and user workflow so that you can register an account, you can upload your own pictures. If you wanted to register, you can register an organisation. So the Canberra Ornithologist Group might register an organisation, and then they might create data sets for every walk that they go on, where they're taking photos of birds. And then each member might upload a resource to that particular walk, which would be a collection of images, or references to images at least. So that would be the Drupal use case, and then on the CKAN side, it's still an information management asset system. So fundamentally, if you're a developer, you would access the CKAN side. If you're the general public user, you'd access the Drupal side. We built into it a couple of cool things. So there's some ingests that come from Twitter. If you set up a data set associated with a hashtag, you can then over time collect all the images that are referenced with that hashtag. Similarly with mentions and Flickr groups or Flickr pools as well. So if there was an existing organisation that already collected everything into Flickr, you can ingest that into CKAN, at least from a reference point of view. And we also did some funky stuff with Amazon in terms of migrating things into Glacier and using Elastic Transcoder service to transcode video files into more appropriate formats. Victorian government, we did a three-tiered CKAN platform, which essentially solves the problem of agency platform versus whole of Victorian government platform versus open data platform. Again, I mentioned the point of Amazon or infrastructure, programmable infrastructure as being key to solving use cases in the future about big data, big voluminous, biggish terabyte type data, and high transactional, high volatility type data from sort of like sensors and things like that. So resource containers behind the scenes. Data pipelines is where some work has been done by Florian Mayer in WA Parks and Wildlife. He had an awesome example of building a complete publishing platform on top of CKAN and RStudio, where essentially, data scientists from across the state that were involved in the sustainability of different regions, providing sustainability reports, would obviously have their atmospheric data, their vegetation data, their soil data, water temperature data, everything. Then they would create charts and graphs, and then they'd write their narrative around the insights, but each of them control different or manage different parts of the state. And that needs to come together as a document every 6 months to be tabled or to be put forward and say, this is the state of our sustainability in terms of our parks and wildlife. And that used to be a Word document. It used to go round the trip, probably took 3 months to produce in terms of edits. So Florian, and working with his approach of data plumbing, built all of the tools required so that the data scientists can basically work within RStudio, within workbooks, create the graphs, and the clippings of those graphs get then stored into CKAN as resources with the originating data. Any code that was actually written in R or in Python to generate the graphs is also stored in CKAN. And then at the end of it, he uses Sweave to basically render out a PDF that, again, reads from CKAN. So it reads through the entire set of the data sets, pulls the descriptors from the data sets, pulls the figures, pulls the data sets in terms of their referenceability, and then it has a nice 300-page report at the end of it, and it's awesome stuff. And this is what we're trying to solve, essentially, with the whole open data machine-readable thing. Over many, many years, we've subjectively created these things using constructs such as Word documents and PDF forms, and with the intention of someone at the end of this process deconstructing it from their own subjective point of view. And it's almost impossible for machines to sort of decipher that and understand how to communicate from those artifacts what the hell we were talking about or trying to communicate. So really we're looking more around schemas, data, and then data accessible via an API so that any application can freely access that and build upon it. And really that's the integration path between CKAN and Drupal, that it is an available resource for anyone in government in Canberra here today federally, and it's becoming a more usable resource across states and territories as well. So get into it, I think. That's me. Any questions or time?